Well, thank you very much for allowing me to be here today to preach, and I appreciate the gift as well. I really do appreciate that. So, to clarify, I am moving to the Bay Area, but just outside, just east of Oakland. So I'll be in the Oakland area, be going to a Disciples of Christ church that has been there since the late 1950s, and they've been pretty well established, and they're looking to call a new pastor. And I felt called to respond to their offer to call me to be their new pastor. Some people have asked me, is it a bigger church? Are you getting a promotion? Are you getting a raise? Why are you going? To be honest, it's a smaller congregation. And really I'm going because I feel kind of led by the Spirit to enter to a new adventure. I also have to say, I trust my wife too. There have been times in the past where some opportunities have come our way, and she looks at me and like, no, that's not going to happen. This is the first time over the years where she was kind of like, this could be a possibility that God's calling us to, and we spent, some time in prayer. She actually started her new job yesterday. So she is a special education teacher. So she got a new job working at a high school in the Bay Area. And she did her teacher orientation yesterday. So she's already living up there in some temporary housing right now, and I'll be joining her in a few weeks as we move up there permanently. So be in prayer for us. We are excited about this new opportunity. But after 14 years of being in my own comfort zone, being very comfortable being here at this church, working with everybody here, it truly is going to be a whole new life experience for us. So we're excited. We're also a little bit nervous. As I reflect back on my time, the 14 years here at First Christian Church of Burbank, I sat down with some people from the board to kind of reflect on our ministry together over those 14 years. What I look back on with a bit of pride, what did I feel that we did well together. We also have looked back and said, what are some of the things that maybe we could have done better, and what are some of those things that we can learn from as we look back on the past. And I have to say, one of the things that I really think about truly as being a wonderful experience in the past 14 years was Segil coming to join us and to worship here. And not just to worship in our building, that from the very beginning, I think we are both clear with one another that we didn't want this to be landlord-renter or just two people sharing a building, that we wanted to find ways for the congregations to partner together. And it's been wonderful to see how that partnership has developed over time. We've really been blessed by your presence, and maybe you don't know or even see how much we feel that we've been blessed by your presence. It's been wonderful when Sue was doing our children's ministry, and to have Sue down there with our children. What a great role Sue played in kind of being a bridge between our two congregations and working together in that way. It's been a blessing as you've involved yourself in some of our worship activities and Christmas Eve services. It's been wonderful to partner on Burbank Temporary Aid Center together, and to see you now picking up an extra month of those lunches. Years and years ago, we only did it every other month. And then with your presence, we've been able now to make sure we do it every single month, to make 125 lunches for Burbank Temporary Aid Center. To have you be involved in part in Family Promise, that's been an exciting part. And I personally, of course, have enjoyed the relationship on the Tijuana home builds, to have many from Segil go down and participate in the Tijuana home builds, to the point where you outnumber the number of people from First Christian Church of Burbank. So that's really a fantastic thing, I think. That's a bit of a challenge to my church to say, hey, come on, First Christian, you gotta, Segil's outnumbering us. But it's a beautiful witness to be down in Mexico, building together with other churches and other disciples' churches. And I think it's wonderful to have Segil's presence there. It adds to the whole dynamic and the dimension of us being disciples of Christ churches working together to do something in the world to better the world. And so as I reflect on the past, there are definitely things that I hold and cherish in my heart. And there are things I look back on I wish I would have done better too. There are ways that I look back and say, I wish I would have partnered with Segil even deeper in various ways. One is I've seen Facebook pictures of many activities that Segil has done, and you look like you're having a really great time. Some have been on your retreats when you've gone up to the mountain together as a congregation, and I'm just a little jealous, like, oh, that looks like so much fun. I should have, should have been the guest preacher for that week. Maybe invite me along, something like that. And also just our relationship and partnering together and hiring Beth to provide our youth ministry for all the youth that attend our congregation, and what a wonderful partnership that has been. That's just been dynamic, and I think that's really, really been helpful. Years ago, we went on a Tijuana home build, and I think it was Andrew's second or third Tijuana home build trip. How many of you been on, Andrew? Do you know? Like 5 or 6 or so. You've been in quite a few. So I think it's like the second or third one. And we came to a point where we had a little bit of a problem, and we were trying to figure something out. And I made this statement. I said, let me go to the van and get the blueprints, the plans, and we'll figure out what the measurements are. At which point Andrew looked at me and went, you guys have plans? He's like, and he was kind of like, it would have really been helpful for me to see those plans on the first build. And so, I'm an architect. I was like, yeah. And he kind of looked at me and he said, I thought you guys were just kind of making this up as you went along. I see all these people just kind of working, and the wood comes together, and people scratching their heads and figuring things out. And I kind of got, it does look like we're making up as we go along. And sometimes every build is a little bit different. No two are ever the same. And we have some basic plans, but even then off of those plans, we have to improvise a little bit depending on the circumstance in the situation. Well, I was thinking about that, and that might look like the way we're doing ministry as well at sometimes. First Christian Church, how are you doing ministry? Are you making it up as you go along, or do you have your set plans and some blueprints and some things laid out? And what I'd say to you is First Christian Church of Burbank has some plans. They have a 5-year plan. They have a 5-year strategic plan. There are goals that they have that they want to accomplish as a congregation. And what I want to make clear to you today is that Segil is an important part in their long-term thinking about who they want to be as a church, as they represent God's kingdom, and as they are disciples of Christ Church. The board, the elders, people at First Christian Church of Burbank have been talking for years and years about the partnership with Segil, and they want that partnership to continue, and they continue to think about ways to strengthen that partnership. Part of that, how is it that you allow Segil to have its own autonomy and function as the church that it is uniquely called to be, and also then how do we find those ways to work together and partner together? So I want you to know that there are 5-year strategic plans. There are plans that First Christian Church of Burbank has as its ministers. And with my departure, they're not going to take those blueprints or those plans and get rid of them. That's an important part of who they are, and you're an important part of those plans. There might be a little improvisation, right? As circumstances come up and demand, how do we negotiate? How do we figure this out? How do we continue to work together? And so I pray that as the future continues to unfold, that you find ways to work together and collectively. And to let you know, that's in the heart of hearts of the leadership of the people at First Christian Church of Burbank, and my departing will not change any of that. I think that needs to be abundantly clear. It's been wonderful to think about the past. One of the negatives about the past is you can't change it. So the future winds up being somewhat more valuable than the past because the future is open. The future is open for us to have possibilities, and there's potentials for us to work towards a greater future. And today in this little scripture passage, we see the Apostle Paul writing a little phrase in the midst of this encouragement to the community, and he says, rejoice in hope. It's an interesting phrase to me. When I realized a few weeks ago that I had 3 weeks left to preach, this being my second to last, next week's going to be my final week with the congregation, I thought, well, I have 3 sermons left. What do I want to preach on? Well, there's lots of threes in the New Testament and in Christian theology. Of course, I could do the Trinity, Father, Son, or Holy Spirit, and I thought of different threes that I could come up with. And what really stood out to me was the Apostle Paul's admonition in Corinthians. When he's writing his famous passage on love, he ends up saying, and these three remain, faith, hope, and love. And the greatest of these is love. So I decided that would be my theme for the next 3 weeks, that I would preach on faith, hope, and love. Last week I preached a sermon on faith. It was fantastic. You should have been there. This week I want to look at hope and the notion of hope, and that's what I bring to you today. And then next week for my final sermon, I'm going to preach on love. And of course, what better way to go out than to preach on love? After all, Paul's real main point in that passage is that there's faith, hope, and love. Those three do remain. They're with us no matter where we find ourselves. No matter where we find ourselves, we can be people of faith, and our faith can sustain us. We can be people of hope, and we can look to the future. And most of all, we can choose to love. And really, Paul's main point is that, and the greatest of these is love. He's setting forth the priorities. Sometimes the most difficult decisions in life are those decisions choosing between good and better. Those are the difficult decisions. Sometimes to choose between good and bad are easy decisions because it's clear one's better than another. And some people think Christianity is about choosing good over evil, which I would say it is. But there's another part in Christianity that it's also about prioritizing what's good and what's better. And those are tougher decisions at times to make. To really distinguish and to sift out what needs to become a priority. We experience it in small ways. Perhaps if you go to a restaurant and there's 2 or 3 items that you're looking at going, that sounds really good. I'm not sure which one to order. And, you maybe ask the waitress, which one's the best? Which one's the specialty? What's the good out of the better? Or for me, it's going to the ice cream shop. 31 flavors. There's 31 good choices, right? Okay, maybe 28 good choices. There's a couple I can get off. But then I have to make a decision between what's good, what's better, what's best. I only get one scoop. Which one am I going to choose? And to make those decisions are tough. And I think Paul in this passage is saying, yes, faith, hope, and love are all the virtues that remain. But out of all of them, make sure you keep love the priority. Love's the greatest. You only have the right kind of faith if it's a loving faith. If there's anything about your faith that moves you away from compassion, it's not the right kind of faith. That's an important message. Too many Christians have not made love the priority, and out of faith, hope, and love, sometimes some make faith the priority. Here's our faith, and sometimes they see it as dogma or creeds, and they put that down in a way, and they can be very unloving at times with the way they express their faith. And we only have the right kind of hope if it's a loving hope. If it's some sort of hope towards the future that opens us up towards love and compassion. And I've seen Christians also make the mistake of even talking about Christian hope in a way that's overly judgmental, as if God's going to be overly punishing, and they talk about the Christian future in a way that is not good news for a lot of people. And I believe they talk about the hope of the future in a way that it's not loving or compassionate and does not resemble the message that we see in the Apostle Paul, or even more importantly, in the person of Jesus. So, how do we speak of hope in a way that is loving? I've been wrestling with the idea of the future. How do I see the future? How do I understand the future? How does the future unfold in my own mind and in my own heart and my own emotions? And as even I think about my own transition during this time and going to a new church, I realize that there's kind of a wave of different emotions about the way I think about the future. There are moments where I open up, I believe, to the possibilities of the future, and I open up to the potentialities of what the future has to open, and I think about newness and creativity and new possibilities entering into the world about God's working. But there are times, too, where I know in my own heart I can kind of give over to cynicism. And right away, even learning about the new church, we're not recording this, are we? Already I've learned that they have certain issues and problems and things going on, and I'm like, churches are just churches. Churches, the same dynamics, same issues, just different faces, just different people, but a lot of the same dynamics, right? And sometimes you can give over to that cynicism and go, people are just people. Same problems, same things stay the same, history repeats itself, nothing ever changes, nothing new under the sun, and it's kind of the cynicism can give in. And then if that goes even farther, you can get to the point where you even begin imagining really bad scenarios. And then I have to be honest that it's actually part of our human condition that we can project onto the future our worst fears. And what we're afraid of afraid of the future, what intimidates us, what scares us. And sometimes our minds can get to that place where we can imagine the very worst of the worst. I've been listening to a series of lectures by a lady named Brene Brown. Brene Brown is a researcher, and she researches interesting kind of social and psychological dynamics, and she wrote a New York Times bestseller called The Power of Vulnerability. And her research has kind of shown, when she talks about people living wholehearted, full lives, she says one of the key aspects to that is that people have to kind of embrace this notion of vulnerability. That if we walk around in our life trying to protect ourselves all the time with our shields up and building these big walls and protecting ourselves from our fears and other people, that it begins to shut us down from the potentials that we have to really enjoy and experience life. That engaging in loving relationships, engaging in community, serving other people, those deep life-giving aspects of the human condition, those all tend to shut down if we try to protect ourselves too much and we're not open to vulnerability. Love means vulnerability. And I would say as well, hope means vulnerability as well. And as Brene Brown did her research, she found that one way that people shut themselves down from the future is by building these walls and these shields towards the future, and those get built up when they project their worst fears into the future. And people want to protect themselves emotionally from the future, and they do so by projecting sometimes worst-case scenarios. Have you ever had a child get their driver's license? That's when this dynamic comes into full force, right? They're 16, they get their license, like, oh my gosh, they're going to be driving on the freeway, and they're going to crash, and they're going to that, and they could hurt themselves, and they could kill themselves or harm someone else, and you can spin out of control. And there's this idea that we want to experience sometimes those worst case scenarios because we think we're protecting ourselves emotionally from what might or could happen. But it's not that rational kind of planning. It's not the rational kind of planning that says, what does the future entail? What are some of the potholes that we might see? What are some of the barriers that we have to overcome? How can I think about planning for some difficulties and being rational? And this is the idea that it gets beyond statistics. It gets beyond being rational. It's just our projection of our fears into worst-case scenarios, and we think somehow that we might protect ourselves emotionally by experiencing it first and foremost through kind of this spinning of projecting our fears into the future. But what she says she's found is that actually emotionally it doesn't protect you from anything. That if a tragedy does happen, you're still just as vulnerable as the person who projected all their fears in the future. That there is no real way to protect yourself. As a matter of fact, often what it does is it just puts up this wall and this shield from experiencing the potentials and the beauties and the wonders of what the future might offer. That it does very little to protect yourself from the bad that may happen, but what it definitely does is it shuts you down from the beauty and the wonder and the goodness that could happen. That this idea of protecting yourself and your emotions in such a way that you begin to shut down towards the future, it has this position that you feel like you're protecting yourself and you're not being vulnerable and you're trying to protect yourself, and yet to really open up to the future, to really engage the future, to really see the potentials and the creativity and the newness that might happen in this world means to be vulnerable. To take those shields down. And so it's interesting for me in the midst of this passage that the Apostle Paul is telling the Christians in Rome to rejoice in hope. He's hitting that dynamic head on. Hope is that virtue of the future, and I believe what Paul is saying is rejoice. Find joy in considering the potentials of the future. Find joy in the knowledge that God is still at work in the future. That God is opening up possibilities. That novelty, newness can enter into this world. All sorts of things can happen. Rejoice and find joy in that. Paul is not naive about the difficulties that these early Christians were facing. Paul knows that these early Christians, particularly in Rome, were in vulnerable positions. And he addresses that. He knows that people in the community have need. He knows that actually some bad things are going to happen and have happened to them. He is not naive about any of that. He's not just trying to sugarcoat the future. But what I think he is doing is he's trying to open the Christians of that community up to the very real potentials of hope. As I reflect on the life of Jesus, we can think about the life of Jesus in many different ways. Here we see someone who comes into the world and embodies God's compassion in a way that he enters in relationship with people in new and novel ways. He goes and he reaches out to the outsiders that have been shunned. He reaches to people who are vulnerable. He takes a chance and a risk, and he challenges the political and social and religious structures of his own day, and he puts his own life on the line. To the point where he risks his life and he winds up being crucified. Now, if we look at that story and tell that story, there is a way that we could say, well, see, you better not hope in the future. Look at Jesus. Jesus tried to go out and minister to people, and look how it wound up for him. And if anything, we can look at the early disciples, and we could see that maybe the disciples were saying, maybe that's not such a good thing. Maybe we shouldn't be vulnerable to the future. Let's build up our walls and our protections, and let's go back to the world as it will be and always will be. The same old, same old. Look, Jesus tried to change things. It didn't work out well for him. And we could see where it might be easy for the earliest disciples to give over to cynicism. To say things can't change, that things can't become more loving or just in our world. And yet somewhere in there, the resurrection made a difference for them. And I believe one of the key differences is that it opened them up once again to hope. Or even as Paul writes in this place, to rejoice in hope. To find joy in the possibilities of the future. To be vulnerable once again. To take a risk and a chance, and to allow their notion of the future to be influenced by the virtue of love. That their hope was influenced by the virtue of love. And the way they saw the future was through the lens of God's compassion, of God's activity in the world. And so I'd encourage all of us today, how do we see the future? Are we giving over to cynicism that what is in the world will always be in the world and things won't change? Have we even taken that a step further and even maybe gotten to the side of cynicism to the point where we actually see that the world kind of works in some sort of mechanistic way, that it's all going to end poorly or badly, that things will only get worse? Trust me, I know during this political season, this is really a difficult message to preach. Because when I see how crazy the political system is getting in the United States, it's easy for me to throw up my hands and say, oh my gosh, there's no hope. I want to give over to cynicism. I'm shocked, amazed, at times perplexed. But the gospel speaks to me. Paul's words speak to me once again. Find ways to rejoice in hope. That no matter how the future begins to unfold, there's still the possibility of God's love breaking into our human history. There's still a possibility for us to be open to that love and compassion and be the source of that love breaking into our world. We can be the people who bring that love. We can open up people's eyes to the possibilities of new things, of the world becoming more just, more loving, more compassionate. What does the future hold for Segil? What does the future hold for First Christian Church of Burbank? I pray it's not the same old, same old. I pray you have hope. Real hope that you can find joy in, that allows you to be vulnerable towards the future and to take a chance on God's love. That you can find new ways to allow that love to work through your life collectively and communally. And that in doing so, there's a message to the rest of the world that the world can change, that God's kingdom can come, that the ministry of Christ can continue, that the resurrection of God's Spirit or Christ's Spirit in our life can be real. We have a choice on how to live. We have a choice in how to orientate our lives towards the future. I pray that you don't let cynicism win the day. I pray Christian hope forms your thoughts, your actions, your behavior, and that the ministry of Christ will change your hearts and minds in a way that you see the wonderful potentials and possibilities of the future that God is opening up for all of us. Let us bow together. Help us to rejoice in hope. Lord, at times it is easy for our hearts to be troubled. It is easy to give over at times to cynicism and despair. But as we see in the life of Christ, even in difficult times, your love can be present. Your love can open us up to new possibilities. That you are the one who can redeem difficult circumstances. And help us to see that possibility. Help us to see that with your love working in our lives, that our lives can have deeper meaning. And that our lives can open up to new creative possibilities that allow your love to break into our lives and the lives of others.